The last lamps of Holborn Viaduct burned low when Mr. Vincey stepped from his cab, paid the jarvey a sixpence, and paused beneath the cathedral hush of the booking hall. A draught of March night pressed after him, curling the posted bills that promised a new 9-hour service from London to Carlisle. Their fresh ink smelled faintly of printer's oil and ambition. Vincey, solicitor by vocation and skeptic by habit, adjusted his muffler and sought the familiar profile of Mr. Bessel. Yet even amid the marble pillars and echoing footfalls, the senior partner remained elusive, as though the hall itself conspired to muffle any sign of him. En route he noted a curious installation spanning the western bay, a brass-bound cage of lattice iron, its interior lined with green bays and coils wound densely upon ebonite spools. Two muscular porters wrestled a crate, labelled Ectenic Force Apparatus Fragile, toward its maw, while a telegraph clerk scratched at a logbook, the nib squealing. Vincey's legal mind catalogued every incongruity: the absence of police permit stamps, the silvery odour of ozone hanging like altar incense, and the clipped instructions of Station Master Arkwright, whose moustaches shook whenever he whispered orders. A bell cracked twice. Rolling doors parted to reveal engine number 956, a new 460 Iron Duke, type already breathing plumes that shimmered violet between the arc lamps. Two ordinary first-class carriages coupled behind a low-roofed van wearing the livery Experimental Telephone Car. Vincey located Bessel at last, stooping by that van's stepboard, fussing with a bundle of insulated wires. The senior partner's aspect had grown leaner since last quarter's séance debacle. Lamplight exposed hollows beneath his eyes, and a livid scaramoured knife-edge of an ethereal encounter glimmered upon his left temple. "You are late," Bessel rasped without turning. The induction coils must warm precisely 23 minutes prior to departure, else the Ruhmkorff output deteriorates below 600 volts. "You recall Bullock's threshold?" He thrust a clipboard toward Vincey, who signed where indicated, though the document's title Provisional Sanction for Trans-Cerebral Projection, Iteration 4 sent a chill coursing his spine. "I recall," Vincey answered, watching his own penmanship tremble. "But Station Master Arkwright insists all experiments remain subordinate to company schedules. Should this contraption delay us?" "The board will. Schedules will conform to nature," Bessel snapped, flicking a lever that woke a low hum inside the van. Somewhere within, mercury relays chattered like restless teeth. "Fetch Mrs. Bullock. Her trance must deepen before the first summit tunnel, else we risk diffusion." The solicitor crossed the platform toward the ladies' waiting room, where Mrs. Bullock, middle-aged, maternal, and modestly gloved, stood placidly beside a valise of violet velvet. She greeted Vincey with a nod, half courteous, half resigned. "Mr. Bessel refuses laudanum," she murmured, smoothing a stray curl. "He says the grey matter must remain unspoiled." Vincey offered his arm. "The law refuses peril without indemnity. Yet here we stand." Quote, he guided her toward the telephone car, noticing as they walked the cough of dynamos and the stutter of galvanometers, registering unseen currents. At the threshold, Station Master Arkwright saluted, his keys jingling upon a long steel chain. "All luggage stowed? Mind the platform gap, madam." Arkwright's voice bore the cadence of habit, yet his eyes lingered upon the Faraday cage with puzzled reverence. "God keep your labours," he added sotto voce, before signalling the guard. With a shrill peal, the train eased forward. Iron wheels found their rhythm, and the gaslit arch of the station dwindled behind blackening panes. London, with all its street lamps and skepticism, slid away like a discarded mask. The telephone car comprised 2 compartments. Foremost stood the apparatus chamber, dominated by the cage. Aft lay a cramped salon outfitted with mahogany benches, a writing desk, and a crimson-shaded dynamo lamp whose light pulsed faintly, synchronized to some hidden exciter. Between compartments hung a serge curtain that brushed Vincey's sleeve like moist breath whenever he passed. Bessel oversaw the portage of instruments, a hemodynamic gauge resembling a stunted barometer, a pocket spectroscope, and Bullock's own planchette board she insisted upon despite objections. Each device found its berth within brass brackets as the locomotive picked up speed beyond Willesden Junction. Vincey busied himself noting mileposts against his chronometer. 14. 7 at Harlesden. 0. 19. 53 at Watford, while recording cabin temperature and coil voltage per Bessel's instructions. At precisely 0:26, the senior partner beckoned. Commence baseline reading. Vincey tightened the tourniquet about Bessel's forearm, watched scarlet column ascend the hemodynamic tube. 72 pulses per minute, pressure at 108 millimeters. The gauge trembled, perhaps from rail vibration, perhaps from something subtler. Mrs. Bullock seated herself cross-legged within the cage, palms upward, eyes already glazed. Bessel knelt outside the lattice, passing insulated leads through a porcelain bushing until they clipped to conductive plates affixed behind her ears. Static isolation engaged, he declared. A switch thunked. Sparks danced along a pair of ball electrodes, casting striated shadows across the carpet. Beyond the curtain, the crimson lamp dimmed, recovered, dimmed again, as though the train's very heartbeat arrested, then restarted. "Your pulse?" Vincey queried. "Irrelevant," Bessel muttered, fastening his own leads to a circlet across his brow. "Observe for alpha erratic waveforms on the wheatstone." Oscilloscope trace pale green glare upon a blackened panel began its serpentine scroll. Vincey noted amplitude fluctuations mimicking respiration. He found himself breathing to the instrument's rhythm, a faint synchrony that unsettled him more than any of Bullock's previous trances. The wheels clacked rapid octaves beneath. The cage bars flickered like dueling shadows. Mrs. Bullock's lips parted. A sigh issued soft, accusatory. Her head inclined, eyelids fluttering. "North, north across iron rivers," she intoned. "Cold steam beneath the world." The planchette, though untouched, twitched once upon its polished board. Vincey swallowed. "She begins to speak." "She is not yet the medium," Bessel said. His face had gone strangely luminous phosphor reflections playing upon perspiration. "Focus, man." The dynamo lamp in the salon guttered, recovered. With each oscillation, Vincey felt the cabin contract, as though atmospheric pressure thickened. His ears popped. Galvanometers clicked past their stops. A smell like singed cinnamon permeated the curtains. "Voltage climbing," he warned. Bessel's eyes rolled upward. "Boundary dissolution, at 600 volts exactly." He flexed his gloved fingers once, twice. Then, with deliberate precision, he closed the primary circuit. A shrill corona snapped across the coils. Ozone flooded the compartment. Mrs. Bullock jerked, spine arching. The hemodynamic gauge spiked and shattered its glass, mercury globules spattering onto the parquet. Vincey's chronometer recorded 0, 40, 1, 12 as its minute hand spun uselessly, glass cracked by unseen concussion. Through the bars, Bessel's body convulsed, leant, almost graceful forward. His eyelids fluttered, then his frame sagged. Silence descended, save for the rushing of wind past sealed windows and the faint, inadequate heartbeat of the train. Vincey reached for his colleague, but arrested his hand mid-air. Some instinct warned that contact might complete an awful circuit. He instead called out, "Bessel, can you hear?" Yet the limp figure emitted no answer. Mrs. Bullock, still seated, spoke again, but in a voice deeper, resonant, bearing none of her Hampshire softness. Projection successful, subject externalized. She smiled, too broad, too certain. Vacancy confirmed. Vincey's throat dried. "Where is he?" "Where?" "4. The woman's pupils widened until irises vanished. He observes the planet from aloft, astonished by curvature. He finds the night locomotive, a silver needle stitching darkness. He is... Her head jerked sideways. A tremor passed through her torso. But something else, something colder also seized the vacancy. The solicitor felt the car sway violently, though track appeared straight. Instruments squealed. A fusillade of faint knocks ran along the roof as if hail struck, though skies were clear merely minutes before. "Cease the current," Vincey commanded and sprang to the switch. To his horror, the lever refused to budge, held as though soldered by invisible heat. Sparks now leapt persistently between electrodes, shedding metallic droplets that hissed upon the carpet. Suddenly, Mrs. Bullock's limbs whipped outward. With a sound like tearing silk, the Faraday cage bars bowed, then snapped inward, pinioned by a translucent filmno, a substance like viscous smoke, interlaced with glimmering filaments. It coalesced about her shoulders, cascaded along brass rods, and dripped as molten iron onto Bessel's slumped form. "Stop!" Vincey cried, useless save for his voice. Something slick touched his ankle. He looked down and beheld a tendril grey, faintly luminous-oozing across the planks, seeking perhaps the warmth of blooded flesh. The solicitor's logic wavered between terror and duty. He seized a mahogany bench and swung it against the main rheostat. Wood splintered, porcelain shattered, the arc collapsed into darkness. In the sudden black, the only light came from the lateral windows where moonlit countryside blurred past, and from ember-like motes still clinging to Mrs. Bullock's form. She sagged forward, unconscious. The grey filament recoiled, writhing back toward Bessel. Vincey, emboldened by its retreat, grabbed the corporal's shoulders and dragged his colleague clear of the ooze, tearing live leads free. A faint pulse irregular, but present answered beneath Bessel's collarbone. Relief surged. Yet triumph proved brief. The locomotive's whistle shrieked without pattern. Brakes hissed. Through translucent panes, Vincey saw signal lamps flicker crimson, then die. The train decelerated not serenely, but in spasmodic jerks that rattled crockery. Somewhere forward, a guard's lamp swung like a panicked comet. Vincey cracked the rear door. Cold wind knifed in, carrying the pungence of scorched insulation. He peered along the darkened consist. Coaches groaned, couplings clanged. Beyond lay a cutting flanked by ash trees branches clawing the mist that pooled like spilt milk. A lone figure stumbled upon the ballast beside the slowing locomotive. Tall, lurching, coat flapping a silhouette Vincey recognized instantly. Bessel, or what seemed Bessel, though his body lay behind Vincey on the floor. The figure turned its head with insect deliberation, eyes glowing faintly grey in the lantern glare. Then it clambered up the carriage steps ahead, disappearing inside second class. Vincey's breath crystallized mid-exhalation. He slammed the door, bolted it. Inside, Mrs. Bullock moaned. The hemodynamic gauge lay shattered. Mercury globules quivered at every tremor. Bessel's eyelids flickered, but did not open. "You have returned?" Vincey whispered, half to himself. A groan of wheel flange announced the train's full stop. Silences save for distant owls. Station Master Arkwright's lantern approached down the ballast, its halo revealing his anxious brow. He called, "Emergency telegraph lines are dead. Some complication with your dynamo." Vincey opened a window slot. "Guard the doors. Something has boarded us." Arkwright frowned. "Nothing left the track save your colleague, whom we assisted moments ago. Remember?" He raised his lantern to illuminate Bessel's supine form within. The contrast of two identical bodies sewn inert, one apparently at larger robbed the station master of speech. His lantern dipped, casting monstrous shadows. "Good Lord," Arkwright murmured. Before further words could form, a vibration coursed along the rails. The rear coaches shuddered, linkage creaking. A muffled scream erupted from second class. Glass shattered. From that gloom surfaced the same lurching silhouette, now dragging some unfortunate passenger by the coat lapels. The victim's feet scrabbled futilely upon the step iron before their head lolled to impossible angle. A brief spark, perhaps static, perhaps soul flickered between their bodies. Then the assailant flung the corpse aside, turned toward Arkwright's lantern, and advanced with deliberate stride. "Back!" Vincey shouted, but the station master seemed nailed to the ballast. At the last moment he swung his lantern brass, heavy into the thing's face. Flame belched, glass burst. The lantern's oil ignited upon the assailant's coat. Yet instead of burning cloth, it hissed against a skin already seething with grey luminescence, oil droplets reforming into spheroids that rolled down like mercury. Arkwright staggered, eyes wide. The creature touched his throat with two extended fingers. Vincey heard a crack, not unlike ice fracturing on a pond. The station master crumpled with neither cry nor convulsion. The assailant straightened, sniffing air like a hound, then pivoted toward the telephone car. Vincey slammed the window. Within, he saw coils still smoking, parquet marred by streaks of retreating ichor. He seized a length of cable, wound it about the door handles, knotted it twice. Mrs. Bullock stirred, whispering, "Grey, lodger," before sinking again. The solicitor assessed their resources: a half-collapsed Faraday cage, 2 portable galvanometers, a shattered chronometer now marking 1, 7 yet frozen mid-tick, and the faint breathing of Mr. Bessel, who lay prisoner of his own apparatus. Outside, whatever wore Bessel's shape rattled the door, testing each fastening with methodical patience. "Think," Vincey muttered. Law training spooled possibilities, proof of identity, writs of habeas corpus, yet none were weapons. He recalled the spectroscope still intact and an unopened cylinder of ionized salt, Bessel claimed, would render ultraviolet anomalies visible. Vincey loaded the sample, sparked the arc. A lance of violet-white light tore across the dim compartment, painting surfaces in eerie chiaroscuro. Upon the parquet, the retreating filaments writhed anew, forming a network like fungal mycelia. Under ordinary light, they were nearly invisible. In the spectroscopic glare, they blazed argent, pulsing as though with capillary flow. Vincey saw their tendrils infiltrate screw heads, brass hinges, even weave into the hairline cracks of ebony wood metallic roots, searching, anchoring. Then a wedge of the door splintered. The imposter thrust an arm through. Flesh? Neut's sleeve burst, revealing fibers akin to silvery gutta percha, strands twisting helically around an inner beam of pale fluorescence. Vincey swung the spectroscope barrel like a cudgel. The instrument shattered against the invading limb, shards tinkling across the floor. The creature withdrew, not in pain but in calculation. "Arkwright is dead," Vincey whispered. "And Bullock may yet follow. I must wake Bessel." He knelt, slapped the partner's cheeks. No response. He recalled Bessel's lecture on galvanic resuscitation. 8 volts direct across the cervix. Vagus might provoke diaphragmatic reflex. Vincey scavenged intact wires, clipped them to the residual battery cells. The jolt arced. Bessel's back arched likewise, gasp ripping his throat. "Vincey," he croaked, pupils dilating. "Am I?" "Your body is reclaimed," Vincey answered. Voice taut. "But an intruder now occupies your absence, wearing your earlier shell. It has killed." Bessel's hands trembled as he felt the floor, perhaps skeptical of his own solidity. "Fault of mine," he whispered. "The grey lodger Bullock foresaw, but my pride discounted." The door shook anew. Hinges squealed as rivets surrendered to internal corrosion-grey threads chewing iron. Vincey hauled Bessel upright. "Ideas?" "Containment," Bessel said, eyes alight with waning intellect. "Enclose it between contraflow fields. The Faraday cage remains serviceable?" Vincey glanced at twisted bars. "Barely. Then we lure it inside, reverse polarity, flood with back, EMF. If the entity is ferromagneticas, the ectoplasm suggests saturation, may dislodge its hold." A final hinge snapped. The door sagged inward. Smoke from extinguished lanterns still specked the air. Bessel steadied himself against the ruined gauge. Vincey retrieved a segment of broken brass bar, hefting it like a saber. He thought of court arguments, of cross-examinations, of composed men behind polished benches and realized none of those arenas prepared him for this. The imposter stepped through the wreck, silhouette haloed by moonlight. Its face, Bessel's faces, smiled with calm ownership, yet around its temples pulsed that grey translucence, seeping gently, endlessly. "Return," Bessel commanded, voice shaky yet earnest. "That form is mine, not yours. You trespass." The thing inclined its head. In its eyes burned an intelligence, antique and bored. It spoke not aloud, but within the tissues of Vincey's mind, a pressure rather than a sound. Vacancy invites tenancy. The words felt superimposed upon bone. Vincey's knees weakened. He pictured the Faraday cage, imagined its bars reasserting electrical law over supernatural intrusion. He raised the brass rod. The impostor advanced. Bessel snatched a dangling coil lead, sparks splitting the dark. He hurled the live wire at the impostor's feet. Contact birthed a fountain of blue flame, the creature's outline spasming. Vincey seized the moment, swinging his improvised weapon across its shoulders, driving it backward toward the mangled lattice. The entity retaliated with preternatural speed, gripping Vincey's forearm. Immediate numbness spread, as though blood replaced by ice. He screamed, forced himself to ram the brass rod beneath its ribsif. Ribs remained. The impact jarred his teeth. The impostor staggered into the cage remnants. Bessel, moving with surprising force, kicked the door latch, slamming half-intact bars around the entity. Vincey collapsed, arm tingling with pins of frost. Bessel twisted a rheostat. Coils spat white fire anew. The cage glowed cherry, then orange. Within, the grey lodger convulsed, its outline flickering between human and amorphous. Vincey found the hemodynamic gauge's mercury pool. He scooped droplets with a tin cup, flung them onto cage floor. Liquid metal danced, drawn into filaments that tangled round the entity's ankles. It shrieked a psychic detonation that set instruments ringing, but offered no audible cry. Voltage rose. Bessel's face tightened. Each tooth gleamed with ozone glare. "Hold," he sputtered. "Hold, until saturation." A fuse blew. Darkness reclaimed the car, broken only by embers of the cooking cage. Silence followed, stiller than any countryside hush, as though world and locomotive alike held breath. Vincey's ears rang. He smelt roasted copper. Slowly, cautiously, Bessel unlatched the cage door. Within lay a grey husk-thin as onion, membrane-slowed like shed skin. It crackled, then collapsed into powder that smoked, as though grieving its own extinction. No sign of Bessel's duplicate remained. The solicitor exhaled shakily. "Is it done?" Bessel wiped sweat, smearing soot across his scar. "Dislodged, perhaps displaced, but destroyed? We may doubt." From somewhere down the train came distant voice guards rousing, passengers disembarking upon dark track. Vincey glanced at his smashed chronometer. The hands pointed now at 3:17. Frozen yet portentous. "We must reach Carlisle," Bessel muttered. "And beyond. The projection opened channels we scarcely conceive." Vincey nodded, though dread gnawed. Through fractured windows, dawn's first pallor crept, pale and unsteady. Illuminating coils burned black, parquet charred, and the silent form of Mrs. Bullock, who now stirred, breath ragged. Outside, a telegraph pole toppled, wires snapping like violin strings. Far above, unseen yet palpable, something vast repositioned its regard. In weeks hence, the railway board would suppress most accounts of the incident, citing brake malfunction and lantern flare. Station Master Arkwright would be buried at Kensal Green beneath a stone funded quietly by Bessel Vincey. Yet rumours thrived, of iron levers grown soft, of mycelial blooms upon brass, of quiet passengers whose pulses echoed telegraph clicks. And within a discreet laboratory near Marylebone, where galvanometers still whispered over stained mahogany, Mr. Bessel prepared iteration 5. His scar had deepened, his eyes seldom closed. Vincey watched, weary. Instruments shone with fresh polish, yet he fancied a pallor clung to their surfaces, faint grey dust impossible to wipe away. Humankind, Bessel wrote in neat hand, governs mind and matter by tenancy, not by right. Keys can be copied, locks eroded, and doors however stout may stand ajar, the instant curiosity outpaces caution. Vincey read the line, felt the chill of that unfinished warning, and knew the express would run again soon, its wheels stitching ignorance to ambition along rails still haunted by a lodger unaccounted. Lamps guttered along the high windows of Bessel's Marylebone laboratory, as though reluctant to illuminate what they witnessed. Mr. Vincey leaned over a drafting board covered in fresh circuit schemata, his fingertips blackened by graphite and resin. Beyond the window panes, a silver drizzle smeared the gaslight of Gloucester Place into trembling bars, each reflection reminding him of the cage bars that had buckled on the Carlisle run. Bessel, gaunt to translucence, stood beside a bank of ringing microchronometers, their pendulums phased a half-second apart to catch temporal shear. "Observe the beat frequencies," he said, his voice a hollow reed. Needles quivered whenever he approached, hinting that some remnant of astral disjunction clung to his tissues. Vincey resisted the urge to step back. "Iteration 5 shall employ twin galvanic loops instead of one," Bessel continued, forcing any intrusive polarity to declare its axis. "Once revealed, it can be shunted into the buffer cells." He tapped a glass tubework bubbling with argon and powdered ferrite. "That is where the lodger will reside, if we remain the landlords." Vincey rubbed aching temples. "You mean to bottle it alive?" "To grant it leasehold," Bessel replied, "bounded by Maxwell and by Boyle." "And by vanity," Vincey murmured, but too low for the other to hear. He studied the ledger of casualties. One station master, 2 passengers. A telegraph boy later found raving about voices in the wires. The board's hush money sat unclaimed, for the families sought no compensation, only explanation. Vincey knew the law offered nothing for metaphysical trespass. No writ reached across the veil. He signed the release for fresh battery acid, knowing the trail now led back to steel rails. The Northwestern Company had scheduled a second experimental Runan unpublicized night service, conveying only goods, wagons, and the refurbished telephone car. The timetable required 9 hours London to Liverpool, with a diversion at Crewe for the new Mersey viaduct. Bessel insisted that motion at valve gear resonance weakened the boundary, rendering projection easier. Vincey suspected the express attracted the lodger as windings attract current. Mrs. Bullock arrived at dusk, escorted by a constable who chewed his moustache in nervous eagerness to depart. The medium's complexion was pale chalk, her pupils rimmed by red fissures of insomnia. Yet she greeted Vincey with a steady nod. "I dreamt of brass orchids," she said, removing her cloak. They grew from the whistle valves, drank the driver's breath. Bessel gave her no soothing word, only positioned a walnut metronome before her and instructed, "Synchronize your pulse to 72. To Vincey he explained that perfect periodicity in the host encouraged destructive interference for any parasitic ingress. Science, like law, now relied upon rhythm more than faith. Outside, a hansom clattered away, its horse neighing at shadows caught between the street's twin lamps. Vincey felt the city itself recoil from their venture, steeples and chimneys leaning subtly outward as though London wished to disown what its sons attempted in her name. Midnight, Euston Sidings. Rain hissed on fresh-painted buffers while shunters uncoupled empties with the care of surgeons. Engine no. 956 had been overhauled. Its brass now lacquered, its cowcatcher sharpened to an improbable gleam. But more striking was the telephone car. Its oak panelling, replaced by nickel-plated struts that carried copper grids in criss-cross tessellation. Bessel termed it a moving Faraday differential resonator. Vincey eyed it like a polished coffin. Station Master Dawlish, successor to Arkwright, approached beneath a colossal umbrella. He spoke briskly of gradients, signal protocols, emergency detonators. Yet his gaze lingered on the car's frosted skylight, where violet sparks hopped between lightning rods, though no dynamo yet turned. He touched his cap to Mrs. Bullock and withdrew, already picturing the accident reports he might need to falsify. The crew were volunteers from Crew Works, each promised double pay and secrecy. Their signatures trembled, ink blotted by the same drizzle that softened Vincey's resolve. Inside, the apparatus chamber smelled of camphor and new-milled mica. A pair of vertical cylinders buffer cell stood amid a halo of laden jars. They burbled faintly, argon displacing atmosphere in slow billows. Bessel measured conductivity across the grids, while Vincey rigged a telegraph relay directly to the guard's van. "If we succeed," Bessel said, "signal with the code word Aldemar. If we fail, cut the line." Vincey pocketed the bone-handled switch, knife meant for that grim contingency. Mrs. Bullock settled upon a padded stool inside a double-layered cage, whose door latched by magnesium catch brilliant as sun if ignited. She took Bessel's hand, pressed a folded scrap into his palm. Vincey glimpsed only 2 words. "Hold fast." The train lurched. Pistons barked. London's gaslit lattice fell away like a decaying constellation as the express breached the outer dark. At Watford Junction, coil voltage climbed smoothly to 800. Instruments sang a chord of healthy resonance. Yet Vincey's legal instincts tingled. Perfection courts calamity. He noted the chronometer, 0:18 precisely where the previous voyage had strained. The telephone, car's grids emitted a mosquito whine harmonic overtones suffusing the timber walls. Mrs. Bullock's breath slowed to measured tides, 1 every 4 seconds. Bessel checked her radial with a phosphor-painted watch glass. He nodded once, then seated himself opposite, fastening silver electrodes under his clavicles. Vincey donned insulating gauntlets and finalized the shunt path from buffer cells to cage. His mind rehearsed affidavits to follow should the lodger claim another victim. Over-tring-cutting the express pierced low fog. Vapor roiled past sidelights, patterning windows with phantasms of deliquescent iron. The driver opened his regulator. Speed climbed beyond 60 miles an hour. Bessel signaled, "Primary closure in 10. Vincey adjusted knobs. Needles swept toward red zones as if eager. His heartbeat drummed time against the teak boards. Bullock's eyelids fluttered. Bessel lowered a lever. The cage flashed strobe white, then settled into steady corona. The phone relay clicked distant guard tapping an all clear. Vincey allowed himself a single breath. This time, projection appeared silent. No shattered glass, no perfumed ozone, only a hush so complete it smothered even the axle roar. He tasted copper on his tongue. Mrs. Bullock spoke, but her lips scarcely moved. Subject departed. Vector ascendant. Bessel's body sagged in harness, head lolling. Vincey peered at galvanometer dials. Amplitude minimal, polarity constant. No grey tendrils crawled. He felt a surge of gratitude until the lamp overhead dimmed, brightened, and froze at icy blue. The mosaic grids began to tremble. Vincey's knuckles whitened on the switch knife. On the far side of the cage, a sheen, like breath upon glass, condensed into a silhouette taller than a man, all angles and waiting silence. The image sharpened Bessel's duplicate again, but this time its neurology jittered like lantern film, frame after frame misaligned. It observed the apparatus, not as predator, but as ingenieur inspecting blueprints. Then it turned its ashen eyes upon Vincey, and smiled with the unhurried delight of a lodger discovering new corridors behind familiar doors. Vincey sliced the telegraph wire. Sparks bit his wrist. The code word Aldemar died unborn. He slammed the auxiliary shunt, diverting charge into buffer cells. The cylinders glowed plum violet, valves chattering. Argon pressure rose. The creature tilted its head, sensing constraint. It reached for the bars. The grids flared, repelling. Yet trails of motile dust escaped its wrists, threading the lattice like smoke through sieve. Vincey backed toward the salon, dragging Bessel's inert body clear. Behind him, storage cabinets rattled as grey mycelia traced their fittings, seeking egress. He recalled Bessel's lecture. Containment relies on differential. Bleed the field, it rebels. Vincey steadied trembling hands, twisted a rheostat to invert phase. Static boomed. The cage's corona reversed pull rather than push. Mrs. Bullock gasped, spine arching. The lodger's outline distorted, sucked toward the buffer cells whose glass now bulged beneath internal storm. Suddenly the locomotive swerved, brakes screaming. A noise like molten bells filled every rivet. The guard's van sheared from the train. Coupling failed. Wagons jackknifed into embankment. Yet the telephone car stayed upright, momentum propelling it onto a spur near Bletchley. Sparks skittered along rails, lighting hedgerows with eldritch fanfare. Inside, Vincey was hurled against a bulkhead. Bessel's body slid, striking his shoulder. Pain lanced, but he held the phase lever fast. The lodger shrieked again within bone, not ere an ultraviolet anguish that shattered 2 thermometer tubes. Mercury globules boiled, clinging to the entity's ankles like shackles. With inexorable suction, the buffer cells drank the shape, drawing its geometry inward until only a mask remained, thin ash swirled by argon vortex. A final flicker, then silence. The cells cooled to dull crimson. Smoke seeped through smashed transom. Distant cries of railwaymen drifted, human and blessedly mundane. Vincey shut down coils, sparks dwindling to ghost fire. He unlatched Bullock's harness. Her eyes opened, pupils enormous. "Did we imprison it?" she whispered. Vincey could not answer. He knelt beside Bessel, loosened straps. The partner's eyelids fluttered. Colour returned slowly, like sunrise across sallow dawn. He inhaled, coughed acrid smoke. "Containment?" Bessel croaked. Vincey gestured toward the humming buffer cells, their glass now clouded with swirling grey motes. "Leasehold," he said. "Signed and sealed." Bessel managed a wan smile. "Then, we become its jailers." Dawn broke over wreckage strewn beside the Grand Junction line. Inspectors chalked axle positions, measured flange scars, blamed frost heave. Yet they avoided the telephone car, whose door Vincey padlocked with the magnesium catch. Inside, the buffer cells pulsed dimly, a heart not of blood, but of uncertain tenancy. Mrs. Bullock lived but spoke little, her voice carrying a faint echo, as though 2 throats overlapped. Bessel walked with a stoop, one hand forever brushing the air before him, mapping unseen currents. At Euston, a discreet siding became temporary quarantine. Yet wires sang with rumour. Stokers whispered of shadowed passengers glimpsed flitting through yard lights, leaving brass rails cold to the touch. In chambers of the Royal Society, Vincey presented a sealed envelope labelled, "To be opened only upon cessation of astral interference." He addressed it to no man but to humanity itself, citing as witness rail mileposts, smashed instruments, and a scar that no surgeon could suture. The envelope remains unbroken, for astral interference persists wherever curiosity outruns caution. And somewhere in a locked carriage, along a siding whose points no longer appear on public diagrams, a soft pulse answers the turning of the world, reminding those who would cross thresholds that tenancy is not ownership, and the rent may be collected in dread. The siding lay forgotten behind a screen of poplars where sparrows nested in rusted signal arms. Yet every dawn Vincey visited to ensure the padlock still chilled his palm with honest metal. One September morning he found the carriage humming at a deeper register, buffer cells throbbing like distant war drums. The nickel grids sweated beads of quicksilver that rolled, merged, and vanished between seams. Alarm born of law and conscience propelled him to Bessel's residence, a narrow house off Wimpole Street whose curtains never rose before noon. He arrived breathless to see telegraph linemen clustered about the facade, wrestling lengths of slackened wire that trailed from chimney pots like severed nerves. "Lightning, sir," their foreman said, pointing to scorched brickwork. Yet skies had stood clear all night. Vincey hurried past them, mounting the stairs 2 at a time. Bessel sat in a darkened study, quills scattered, eyes glittering above diagrams of the human spine overlaid with relay symbols. A soft oscillograph clicked at his elbow, its stylus tracing erratic saw teeth that spelled some private arrhythmia. He greeted Vincey without surprise. Containment decays. The argon grows turbid. Saturation falls. He produced a matchbox. Inside writhed a filament, no wider than a hair, glowing dull pewter. It extruded through 5 inches of compound glass. I trapped it in phosphor to watch its metabolic drift. The filament flexed, sensing freedom through the cardboard walls. "The lodger is prospecting," Bessel said, voice scarcely human. "Given hours, it will map every coil path to the city, perhaps to the marrow of men." Vincey felt a squeeze behind his eyes. "Then we relocate the cells beyond its interest, scape a flow, rockle, wherever iron is scarce and salt devours corrosion." Bessel shook his head. "Distance is delay, not reprieve. Better, we end the tenancy." He unfurled a plan: shatter the buffer glass within a low-pressure chamber aboard the North Sea balloon. Post, ignite magnesium at apogee, and vent the ashes to solar wind. Vincey swallowed the scale of risk. Hydrogen, lightning, a parasite eager for circuits failure promised a conflagration visible from Marseille. Yet legality offered no clause kinder. They set departure for Michaelmas Eve, when the Admiralty's balloon scheduled a mail sortie to Heligoland. The carriage, winched onto a flatbed, lurched north under a moon that seemed to follow like a landlord collecting rent. Near Peterborough their engines stalled. Drivers found boiler feedwater clotted with gummy silt, that stank of milled copper. Replacement pumps, clogged minutes later. Vincey walked the ballast, lamp raised, and discovered the rails ahead furred with grey mould glittering faintly mycelia nursing on residual current between sleepers. He ordered a detour via Spalding. Still the mould reappeared, as though the lodger anticipated every junction. By dawn they reached the Arnas grounds at Kingsnorth, where the balloon ship, Resolute, a vast silk whale, strained against its tethers. Crews winched the telephone car into an aluminium gondola slung beneath the gas bag. Bessel supervised while Vincey drafted indemnities none would sign. Mrs. Bullock arrived unbidden, cheeks hollow but gaze unwavering. "It speaks in pulses now," she murmured, laying a hand upon the gondola's ribs. "Promises relief from gravity, from blood." Vincey urged her to rest shore, sighed, but she shook her head. Witness must ride the verdict. With reluctance they stowed her amid ether flasks and oxygen sacks. At noon the Resolute soared, propellers thrumming. Below, Medway channels glittered like quicksilver veins. Inside the pressure cuff, Bessel monitored barographs. At 5,000 feet, he positioned a tungsten rod above the buffer cell's relief valve, magnesium cluster wired to flash upon breach. Vincey checked the timer against his repaired chronometer 3. 17 p.m. Symmetry uninvited yet precise. Wind keened along girder struts, carrying a metallic whisper that set every tensioned wire singing a single unresolved chord. Bessel cracked the valve. Argon hissed. Grey particulate whirled out, coalescing round the tungsten like frost upon lantern. Glass. For a heartbeat nothing else occurred than the lodger blossomed. It was no longer a silhouette but a storm of curvilinear filaments, spiraling Mobius bands seeking anchor in steel, in bone. Vincey watched strands pierce rivet holes, creep along cable braids toward the gondola's sparking dynamos. One tendril brushed his boot, tingling like snowmelt. He lunged, severing it with an axe kept for ballast trimming. The piece writhed, dividing into smaller threads that vanished between deck planks. "Ignite!" Bessel cried. Vincey struck the magnesium fuse. White fury erupted, drowning vision in ultraviolet. But the blast merely dazed the storm. Filaments recoiled, regrouped, darker now, as though ingesting light itself. Instrument glass crazed. The balloon bucked, hydrogen sacs groaning. Mrs. Bullock, half conscious, whispered, "Lease forfeited." Realization knifed Vincey. The lodger fed on differential, and their flash had paid fresh deposit. Destroying the buffer freed it wholly. They needed cancellation, not combustion. He glimpsed the emergency vent lever designed to dump hydrogen in crisis. Air equalization would collapse the ship, burying parasite and host in tidal mud. Fate of crew? A solicitor weighs outcomes. He met Bessel's eyes. The older man nodded once and pulled the leather hood over his apparatus. Vincey seized the vent chain. The roar of escaping gas was answerless. The Resolute sagged, tailplanes fluttering as altitude bled, filaments thrashed, losing buoyant host. Some clutched girders, others spun away into cloud, unheard screams of shredded static. The gondola plunged through mist, canvas tearing, spars snapping like quills. Vincey braced beside Mrs. Bullock, sheltering her beneath fallen netting. Bessel struggled at the forward rail, recording barograph descent until a shroud rope whipped past, flinging him outward into pale void. Impact came as muffled thunder, mud, reeds, and salt spray folding over wreckage. Consciousness fractured into brine and iron. When Vincey clawed daylight, the gondola lay crumpled in a Medway salt marsh, hydrogen ghosts curling skyward. No grey filaments stridently torn silk fluttering like spent ectoplasm. Mrs. Bullock breathed beside him, pulse erratic but mortal. Of Bessel there was no sign save a notebook floating between samphire stalks, its cover scorched, pages ink-bled yet legible. Vincey opened to the final entry, scrawled at 10,000 feet. If victory costs tenancy of flesh, better to let earth itself be the landlord. Mind is privilege, not title. He closed the book, hearing distant bells from Chatham Dockyard ring the hour 3. 17 again, immutable. Weeks later, parliamentary rumours spoke of an aerostat accident. None mentioned grey mould blooming briefly along Admiralty telegraphs before fizzling into inert ash. The quarantine siding at Euston was dismantled, iron rails recast into mundane type bars. Yet Vincey keeps Bessel's notebook locked within his chambers, alongside a small matchbox now empty, though some nights it rattles faintly. He walks often by marshlands where wreckage rusts, finding in every hummock of iron-speckled lichen a reminder that tenancy is never fully revoked, merely deferred, until curiosity signs a new lease upon the unknown. Autumn sunlight slanted across Vincey's chambers, yet the air seemed tinted by that marshland pallor, as though the lodger's shadow clung to his very cornea. Clients came and wentland disputes. Minor frauds, yet each signature he witnessed reminded him how fragile ownership was when measured against unseen trespass. One morning a docket arrived, stamped urgent by the General Post Office. Irregularities in the North Sea cable near Lowestoft, pulses of static coinciding with the exact minute of the Resolute's plunge. They invited him, by reputation more than rank, to advise on exceptional electrical phenomena. Vincey hesitated, then burned the letter. He had tasted enough of the extraordinary to know inquiry fed the thing it hunted. That night he dreamed again of Bessel sliding into cloud, notebook clutched like a sacrament. The silent figure halted mid-plummet, poised as though buoyed by an invisible lattice, and raised a hand in warning. Vincey woke, gasping, to the scent of singed metal. The matchbox lay on his desk, where he had locked it inside the safe, lid ajar, a charcoal spiral nested within. It twitched once, then crumbled to ash. He sealed the fragments in a lead paperweight and placed it beneath the floorboards. Weeks passed untroubled until a telegraph boy collapsed outside the inner temple, muttering of somersaulting letters that wrote themselves across the line. Surgeons found a metallic sheen on the boy's optic nerves, as if fine filings had replaced tissue. Vincey attended the inquest, hoping to dismiss coincidence. Instead, he saw the boy's pupils pulse grey, under the gaslight's each dilation a Morse dot. The jury recorded natural causes, but Vincey walked out before verdict, ears ringing with phantom clicks that spelled Aldemar again and again. He visited Mrs. Bullock at St. Thomas's convalescent wing, where she mended slowly among wards of industrial injuries. She greeted him with a weak smile, eyes veiled by morphine. "It found another wire," she whispered. "Sea cables, house bells, the silver salt in photographic platesit will never cease prospecting." Vincey asked whether prayer or seance might hinder it. She shook her head. drifting back into narcotic mist. Only ignorance starves it. Speak nothing, measure nothing, and perhaps it wanders unfed. Outside the ward, Vincey met the superintendent seeking funds for an experimental X-ray lamp to image pulmonary lesions. The solicitor signed the grant but felt betrayal coiling in his gut. Curiosity could not be muzzled long. Humanity's hunger for revelation would draft a new lease, inked with voltage and wonder. Christmas Eve, snow dusted the Medway flats, glazing scattered girders of the Resolute like bones in a reliquary. Vincey returned, drawn by guilt or gravity. He carried Bessel's notebook, now wrapped in oilskin, intent on consigning it to brine. At the crash site he found iron lilies of grey alloy blooming where salt water licked broken spars. They chimed faintly in the wind, each petal a tuned lamina of electroplated marsh grass. Kneeling, he opened the notebook to the last blank page and wrote a single line. Mind is tenancy on parole. Then he wedged the volume beneath a rib of oxidized aluminium and watched tidewater reclaim the words. As dusk thickened, distant signal lamps from the Chatham line glimmered through falling snow, their colors winking like coded invitations. Vincey turned his back on the rails. In his coat pocket, the lead weight warmed inexplicably, as though something within tested bonds, mapping the atoms of its prison one tremor at a time. He adjusted his muffler, resolved to tell no soul of what he carried, yet knowing silence itself might merely postpone the hour, rent would again come due. Behind him, the iron lilies chimed. Ahead, telegraph wires thrummed beneath the load of snow-an, unseen melody, threading human invention, patient and interminable, waiting for the next curious hand to lift the receiver. The first days of the new century unfurled beneath a pall of industrial dawns, their skies latticed with the infant cough of spark-gap transmitters. Mr. Vincey, now grey at the temples, could not cross Charing Cross Bridge without feeling the air prickle where invisible messages vaulted the Thames. In April he was summoned to the General Post Office, where engineers boasted of a Marconi relay that had carried spoken words from Chelmsford to Croydon. They invited him to witness the next trial. He declined, pleading influenza. Yet all night he lay awake, hearing stray syllables crackle along his mantle, clock-disjointed phonemes, repeating his name in metered bursts. By dawn, the roses on his wallpaper had curled at the edges, their red ink filmed with an opalescent grey like tarnished silver plate. In May, an itinerant lecturer, Dr. Hartman, hired the Queen's Hall to display a wireless musical telegraph. Vincey bought a ticket, drawn as a moth toward flame. On stage, Hartman coaxed melodies from a boxed coil. Sound issued from brass horns without wires. Applause swelled until every lamp in the hall flickered to corpse blue, and the horns spat a second strain, discordant and slow, like a funeral march performed backwards. Audience members clutched temples. One violinist vomited black bile upon his frock coat. Hartman staggered, mouth working soundlessly, while the coil smoked with threads of writhing silver. Vincey forced his way forward and struck the main switch. Darkness fell, broken only by screams and the distant peal of a fire engine. The coil melted to slag. Amid reeking insulation, he glimpsed a single filament retreating into floorboards, questing towards subterranean telegraph lines. Convinced silence alone could starve the thing, Vincey sought the one refuge where current could be turned to stone, the Derbyshire steelworks at Clay Cross, whose Bessemer converters swallowed tons of ore nightly. He travelled with a lead canister sealed in red wax, the last residue of the lodger's ash. Foreman Llewellyn, bribed with company paper, agreed to drop the weight into a crucible at full flux, temperature sufficient to fuse granite. As slag roared like a captive sun, Vincey felt the factory girders shudder, though no hammer fell. Overhead cranes froze mid-arc. Their magnets crackled with unsolicited charge, cables shimmering grey. The molten bath convulsed, ejecting gouts of blue fire that congealed mid-air into lattice spears. Workers fled. Vincey, sleeves smouldering, heaved a scrap iron bar against the crane's control relay, forcing overload. Sparks cascaded, severing power. In the sudden hush, the spears shattered into lifeless slag, plunging back into the converter. The lead weight vanished beneath a skin of cooling iron, entombed in a mass no drill could later penetrate. Days later, Vincey walked the foundry yard, boots crunching cinders now harmless except for an oily sheen that rainbowed in the sunlight. No pulse echoed in his skull. Telegraph lines overhead whistled only with wind. He dared hope. Yet that evening a letter arrived from Lowestoft, cable hiss returning, but fainter, slower, as though the sea itself rehearsed forgotten code. Vincey burned the paper unread by any other eyes, then closed his office, sold his practice, and withdrew to a small cottage near Keswick, where no telegraph poles marred the skyline. Years passed. Motorcars displaced hansoms, sodium lamps replaced gas. Visitors found Mr. Vincey a stooped figure who wandered the fells at dusk, tapping rocks with a brass rod to test their silence. He spoke rarely of London, never of railways. But children claimed that on calm nights, if one pressed an ear to the wrought-iron fence outside his gate, distant clicks could be heard soft, patient, counting out measures older than speech. One November morning, 1902, Vincey's housekeeper entered his study and found a fresh page in his hand-pressed diary, the ink still wet, though he had left for his customary walk. It read, "Tenancy resumes when curiosity signs anew. Guard your questions." He did not return that evening, nor the next. Search parties traced his footprints to the shore of Derwentwater, where frost-rimmed reeds chimed like miniature telegraph keys, their stems filmed with a grey so fine it might have been hoarfrost or ash. To this day, hikers report an odd hush upon that bank, as though the air waits for something undefinably technical to resume. And railwaymen on the overnight freight to Carlisle sometimes see pale sparks dancing along empty wagon rails, matching the rhythm of unseen hoofbeats. They dismiss it as static, yet cross themselves nonetheless, mindful that mind and matter remain only provisional conquerors in a universe ever willing to renegotiate its leases. In the spring of 1905, a narrow-gauge inspection trolley rattled along the relayed track near Shap Summit, carrying Mr. Edwin Sharp of the General Post Office and Miss Clara Dawlishniece of the late station master now, an electrical draftswoman of rare facility. The air at that altitude tasted of iron filings. Clay embankments still bore scars where the experimental express had once ground to an unplanned halt. Sharp's orders were plain. Trace the source of a faint, rhythmic interference plaguing the Transpennine telegraph loop, an interference timed uncannily to the hour when Vincey's last diary line had been penned. Dawlish hunched over a boxy wave meter, its cat whisker detector glowing amber in the morning sun. Sharp peaks crawled across its frosted drum each time the rails joined and parted beneath the trolley's wheels. She tapped a stylus against the chart. "Amplitude rises at junction plates," she murmured, the tremor in her voice hidden beneath professional diction. "It is feeding on continuity." They stopped at milepost 193/4, an innocuous cut flanked by blackthorn and damp stone. The rails here were new shining with the company's latest chromium alloy yet. Dawlish knelt to brush a streak of matte grey clinging to a fishplate bolt. The residue frothed away from her glove as though resentful of daylight. Sharp unscrewed the bolt for sampling. The threads below had vanished, replaced by a honeycomb void the exact geometry of crystalline snowflakes. "Electro? Corrosion?" he offered. Dawlish shook her head, adjusting her pince-nez. "Corrosion is blind," she said. "This appears deliberate." Her wave meter crackled with a soft staccato dot, 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 dash, dash, then fell silent, as if aware of its own betrayal. A northbound freight thundered past, wick lamps flickering scarlet. Between wagons, Sharp glimpsed sparks dancing along coupling rods, tiny willow, the wisps flitting from link to link. He recalled reports of cattle spooked near Carlisle, hides mottled with odd burn rings. Dawlish packed the specimen in mica foil. "We should consult Mrs. Bullock," she said. "She sleeps poorly but remains attuned." Sharp resisted. The Home Secretary frowned upon psychical inquiries. Yet he had heard that Bullock, housed now in a Whitby hospice, sometimes traced invisible letters on her bedsheet scriptograms, later matched to Morse bursts seaborne through Atlantic cables. They reached Kendal by dusk, telegraph lines singing faintly in the wind. Inside the tiny station office, Sharp wired London for a locomotive with dynamo car and isolation brake terms, echoing those from suppressed Carlisle manifests. As he tapped the key, static flooded his headset, coalescing into a whisper not of sparks but of voices soft, courtly, threaded with antiquated cadence. Vacancy, renewed, lease, unbroken. Sharp froze, fingers hovering. The sound faded, leaving copper tang in his mouth. Dawlish lifted her eyes from drafting pad. "You heard it too?" She said not a question. They hired a dog cart to Whitby, wheels hissing over moorland sleet. The hospice perched above crashing surf, its windows salted opaque. Matron led them to a dim ward where Mrs. Bullock lay swaddled like a revenant queen. Her eyes, filmed yet penetrating, flicked toward the mica packet. "You bring filings," she rasped. Fragments of the lodger's map. Dawlish knelt, removing the foil. The grey specks writhed, realigning into strands that pointed unerringly toward a shuttered window facing landward rails. Bullock's lips shaped syllables in perfect tempo to the wave meter's last reading. ... Dash, dash. "It learned patience in iron," she whispered. "Now it seeks flesh that moves upon iron." Sharp's pen scratched notes his rational mind already feared to read. "Can containment be renewed?" he asked. Bullock's laugh rattled like wind through broken teeth. Containment was debt. You cannot imprison a creditor. You can only renegotiate. She gestured to Dawlish. The Dawlish blood owes arrears Arkwright, her kin, first to breach the ledger. She must parley. Clara paled but squared her shoulders. "Terms?" Bullock closed her eyes. The ward light dimmed, bulbs shivering. "Journey at threshold speed," she intoned. 9 hours London to Carlisle. Carriage 10. Dynamo at resonance. Offer silence for signal, stillness for motion. Only thus may tenancy lapse. Sharp escorted Dawlish to the corridor where storm lamps flickered. "A second experimental run?" he murmured. "The board will never sanction." But Dawlish's gaze stayed fixed on a wall, map of trunk routes. "Then it proceeds unsanctioned," she said. "The lodger already boards every night train in spirit. Better one carriage than all." She fingered Arkwright's brass whistle, inherited and kept polished. Its metal felt unnaturally cool, as if awaiting breath not of lungs but of magnetism. Within a fortnight their scheme materialized. A single dynamo van coupled behind a modest 442 Atlantic, crew sworn to secrecy. Bullock, too frail to travel, pressed upon Dawlish a strip of woven copper hair threaded through with mercury leftover strands. "Speak only in mind," she counseled. "The rails will translate." At midnight, beneath murky gas, lamps of Euston's disused bay, Dawlish climbed aboard. Sharp armed the van with rheostats salvaged from Vincey's confiscated equipment, each label scratched but legible. Saturation, phase, oblivion. The mica specimen was placed in a Faraday flask at car center. Above it, coils murmured with nascent field. Departure sounded like pen nibs snapping, a fragile click, then inexorable motion. London receded. The carriage absorbed vibration until steel nails rattled against oak. Dawlish tuned the dynamo to Vincey's chronometer-kept wound, by unknown custodian and waited for milepost rhythms to sync with the wave meter's silent pendulum. At Watford, lights dimmed precisely as before. No grey film showed, only the sense of an upright presence pacing unseen aisles. She resisted looking, recalling Bullock's maxim, "Curiosity inks leases." Instead, she whispered into the copper braid, surrendering details of her heartbeat, her memories of Shap's keen air, her childhood games among semaphore arm-simple human wavelengths. Somewhere past Rugby, a hush fell, so complete the engine's exhaust lost its note. Dawlish closed her eyes. The wavemeter's drum etched nothing. Yet inside her skull Morse bursts blossomed like frost roses. "Vacanilles expires," she inhaled. Answered, with a thought shaped not in letters, but in the rhythm of footsteps along a garden path. Arkwright's boots on morning duty, a pattern of honest service. The reply came softer. Grace. Period. Dawlish adjusted phase, easing coil output until corona faded. She felt the presence recede, not angrily but with economic finality. Her watch read 3:17. The chronometer halted, then ticked anew of its own accord. Dawn found the train coasting into Carlisle goods yard, wheels singing a final diminuendo. Sharp, waiting, noted no grey bloom on buffers. The Faraday flask contained inert dust, dull and motionless. Dawlish stepped onto ballast, handing him the braid now warm as living flesh. "Parley concluded," she said. "Rent deferred." Sharp exhaled a fog of relief. Yet he pocketed Vincey's chronometer with care, aware its silence could resume without warning. Weeks later the interference ceased. Marconi's crooners resumed clear timbre. But railway fitters still find bolts sometimes hollowed to honeycomb under milepost 193/4, and telegraph boys swear certain snow-laden reeds near Derwent Water tap an unclaimed code at winter dusk. Dawlish, now chief engineer, keeps a sealed cabinet labelled Prospice. Within lie the braided copper hair, the mica dust, and a single blank ledger titled "Leases Forthcoming." On still nights, she imagines faint ticking and reminds herself that mind and matter remain mere trustees, holding open doors whose tenants count patience among their eternal assets. Spring rain drummed upon the slate roofs of Carlisle, while Clara Dawlish paced the quiet hall of the goods depot, chronometer clasped in her glove like a cooling heart. The dynamo van sat uncoupled on a siding, its brass grids already fogged by Midland mist, yet no tremor shook the Faraday flask within. Sharp lingered by a telegraph pole felled during the night, linemen puzzled over its splintered core, each ring discolored by serpentine grey veins. "Weather, rot," the foreman muttered. Sharp knew better but kept silent. Dawlish's thoughts drifted to Vincey missing 3 years, now imagining him wandering some liminal trackside, counting sleepers in unending dusk. She pressed the copper braid to her ear. Only the sea, shell hush of blood replied. Still, her spine tingled each time a goods engine clanged its couplings beyond the fog, as though an unseen auditor tallied human industry against cosmic arrears. That evening she dined at the Imperial Hotel with Director Aldershaw, whose interest in wireless continuities bordered on obsession. Over claret he declared that the Admiralty intended to wrap every battleship mast in inductive coils, broadcasting power enough to light cities. Dawlish envisioned filaments uncoiling from brine-washed spars, threading the ether for tenancy renewed. She warned of impedance anomalies. Aldershaw waved his cigar. "Progress is a mortgage on tomorrow," he jested. "We pay interest gladly." He failed to notice the ash at his cigar tip, twist into perfect Morse before collapsing into the dish. Weeks later, Dawlish received a parcel wrapped in oiled canvas, no return address, postmarked Keswick. Within lay Vincey's brass rod, its tip fused to a smooth puck of vitrified slate, bearing 3 concentric fractures like ripples frozen mid-pond. A folded page accompanied. Lease records unsettled. Inquiry inevitable. Guard milestones. The ink matched Vincey's solicitor hand, but faint scoring marred every loop as though penned against vibrating glass. Dawlish laid the rod upon her workshop bench. Galvanometer needles twitched though no current flowed. She traced the fractures, noting their radii corresponded exactly to the 9-hour schedule once binding London to Carlisle. Something in the stone marked stations. Euston, Watford, Rugby, Crewe, Shap, Carley Sleech. Crack an interval of remembered dread. She travelled south, rod encased in lead, determined to map resonances along the original route. At Watford the rod glimmered under the station lamps, faint auroral bands skating its surface. Porters complained of earache, clocks lagged 3 ticks each minute. At Rugby, the rod's tip vibrated so fiercely she feared it might shatter. Points jammed on the down-fast line moments later, delaying an express whose passengers later reported voices in the upholstery, whispering arrival times before guards announced them. Dawlish marked every disturbance, plotting frequencies upon vellum. The pattern formed an accelerating spiral, its apex converging on an unassuming goods loop north of Crewe, where rails still carried the ghost-bright imprint of melted snowflakes from Sharp's earlier survey. Night cloaked the loop when Dawlish stepped from her inspection motor car, rod in hand, breath silver between arc lamps. The rod hummed, guiding her along ballast until she found a man kneeling between sleepers, fingertips pressed to the railheads. Moonlight revealed Vincey gaunt, bearded, eyes reflecting starlight as though twin coil cores. He rose slowly, voice like rusted telegraph wire. Grace expires. The rod quivered, then stilled. Dawlish approached, noticing the slate puck now glowing inside its lead shell. "We deferred the rent," she said. Vincey shook his head. Interest compounded. He gestured along the deserted stretch. Rails shimmered, grey filaments surfacing like eelgrass in tidal surge. It demanded silence. Mankind broadcast symphonies. He handed her a small tin matchbox, the same once rattling ash. "Seed stock," he whispered. "If curiosity grows, sow this in molten iron again." A whistle sounded distant unlisted freight approaching. Vincey stepped onto the 6-foot. "My tenancy lapses tonight," he murmured. "Advise them. Mind must yield ground to matter until humility rewrites the charter." Dawlish reached, but mists swirled. His form diffused, dissolving into strands drawn horizon. Ward, threading rail to engine lamp now carving tunnels through fog. The locomotive roared past. When vision cleared, only footprints remained, each filling slowly with quicksilver dew. Dawlish returned to London, the matchbox locked beneath triple gaskets. She drafted new specifications. Surge arresters on every coil, silent circuits to quell spectral harmonics, and iron lilies. Bessel's pattern recast, as cautionary plaques, mounted at milepost 190¾ Sharp submitted her proposal to the board. Aldershaw balked, but approved under reserve funds, citing psychical insurance. Installation crews laboured throughout summer. Incidents waned. Yet every Michaelmas, exactly at 3:17, telegraph offices from Carlisle to Euston log a single, undeciphered burst 3 dots, 3 dashes, 3 dots followed by hush. So total, even the Earth return lines register null. In her Bloomsbury office, Dawlish keeps Vincey's rod sealed in ebonite, its slate puck dark save one silvery vein that pulses only when wireless symphonies flood the night sky. She notes each flicker, recording amplitude, but never decodes duration. Some debts, she has learned, cannot be paid, only acknowledged in silence. An annual memorial that mind's dominion rides rails owned always. Ultimately, by deeper tenants who regard human leases as footnotes to a ledger older than iron and as patient as the turning world. Early in the autumn of 1906, the Admiralty completed the giant long-wave tower at Clevedon, its 400 feet of lattice steel crowned by bronze spheres, meant to hurl power across the Atlantic. Clara Dawlish stood beside the switch house windows as the sun dipped red behind 7 mudflats, remembering Bullock's counsel against fresh harmonics. Yet directives arrived embossed with the royal cipher. Delay invited accusations of Luddism. She signed the commissioning docket, throat tight, and felt the old braid in her pocket stir like a coiled heartbeat. Engineers flooded the tuned circuits with amperes. Rotors whined, and a corona rose around the mast like pale heather. For one breathless minute the instruments purred with intolerance as then. The galvanometer needles sank to 0 though current still roared. Outside, cables vibrated in silent semaphore, spelling a rhythm no operator recognized, but every migratory bird above the estuary abruptly matched, wheeling into a black spiral that eclipsed dusk, before smashing headlong into the gleaming tower's nets of copper. Dawlish raced into the yard as carcasses thudded against steel and feathers caught fire in the discharge. A clerk clutched his scalp, shrieking that the waveform recorder was etching backwards, paper feeding itself into the stylus as though time revised its audit. She severed mains with an axe she kept for grim contingencies. The corona extinguished, leaving only the sickening buzz of flesh sizzling on hot cables. Among the wreckage, she saw grey filaments coiling from scorched beaks toward exposed wire-finding, testing, tasting. The braid in her pocket stiffened with heat. She understood. The lodger, thwarted on rails, now scouted aerial lines whose reach spanned oceans. Silence was no longer enough. Humanity's shouting had become planetary scale. 2 nights later, Dawlish convened a clandestine council in the dim back room of the patent office, summoning Sharp, Matron Bullock, and a reluctant Aldershaw whose face blanched at every mention of compounded interest. Bullock, propped by cushions, traced loops through the table's cigar smoke, the motions aligning with the silent clicks of a crippled metronome. "The tenant has found loftier corridors," she rasped. "Steel rails were its footpaths. Ether is its highway." Sharp produced blueprints of submarine cables and asked if seawater impeded the thing. Bullock shook her head only. Molten continuity seemed to stun it, brief as lightning. Dawlish proposed building an intentional breaker, a travelling Furnation armoured wagon fitted with rotary converters, quartz arc lamps, and a crucible kept white, hot by oil, fed blowers. Driven along the Great Western Main Line at threshold speed, it might draw the lodger wholesale, then pour itself and passenger into a prepared chasm of slag beneath Clay Cross. Aldershaw scoffed, but Bullock's wasted lips curved in brittle approval. Winter found crews assembling the furnace car at Swindon Works under pre-dawn secrecy. Plates of manganized steel were bolted over timbers. A 6-inch firebrick crucible occupied the center, fed air by twin roots blowers. Dawlish installed 3 redundancies, an induction cage around the car's frame, a magnesium-cut, wire fuse rigged to collapse the crucible straight through the floor, and a bank of Leyden jars primed to flash vaporize any extravasating filament in 6/millionths of a second. Every bolt head was stamped with Bessel's iron lily, each imprint filled with liquid glass so no grey crystal might root. Sharp obtained a special fast-pather midnight slot between Parcelstow, haul the infernal carriage from Paddington to the Derbyshire pits. The schedule read 9 hours 40. Dawlish shaved it to 9, coaxing the driver with a raise no ledger would ever acknowledge. On Candlemas Eve, a sleet wind hissed along the platform canopies as the armoured car rolled under tarpaulin, furnace already at yellow heat. Dawlish, clad in oilskin and mica goggles, supervised coupling to the waiting 460 Badminton, whose crew had sworn oaths of silence stronger than naval code. Sharp passed her the matchbox seedstock Vincey had entrusted, now glowing like a banked ember. Bullock, too frail to stand, had written a single line: "Give heat unto heat. Leave thought behind." With grim nod they boarded. At 07 the express cleared, reading, boiler roar smothering the furnace's howl. Dawlish locked herself beside the crucible, braid coiled about her wrist, chronometer ticking its fateful cadence toward 3:17. At Didcot, the induction cage hummed. Thin vapors of mercury rose from bolt seams despite frost. Dawlish watched sparks dance between rivets, converging upon the crucible lip. Filaments wept from the ceiling rivulets of grey lightning, slower than fire yet faster than thought, each slithering into the liquid steel's incandescent glare before recoiling. Puzzled by the silence of molten continuity, she prized the matchbox open with iron tongs and tipped the seed ash into the crucible. The alloy erupted in blue-white fury, a flare so bright it bleached colour from her world. Instruments flat-lined, every watch on board stopped. Beyond the armour she sensed the locomotive's rhythm falter, as though rails themselves buckled from metaphysical traction. South of Banbury a tremor rippled through the train. Couplings groaned under torsion, the guard's van lantern imploded with inward suction. The furnace car windows filmed with frost despite internal heat. On that frosted glass shapes appeared handprints of negative temperature. 5 fingers, then 17, then countless outlines overlapping like ledger sheets fluttering in solvent wind. They pressed, retreated, negotiated in silent Morse Dawlish refused to decipher. She pulled the magnesium fuse. White brilliance burst beneath the car, severing the crucible's stanchions. Molten load plunged through the sacrificial hatch into a bed of salt-doped clinker that hissed and swallowed the glowing sphere whole. The car rocked as air blasted outward. Grey filaments screamed ultraviolet across her optic nerves, yet found no anchor, drawn irrevocably after their matrix into depths of slag. The remaining miles thundered past in stunned hush. When the train coasted into Clay Cross at dawn, furnace car gutted and blackened, Dawlish emerged coated with vitrified dust, braid fused to her wrist in glassy scar. Inspectors peered into the clinker pit. Only a cooled bulb of metal lay there, surface marbled with concentric ripples like fossilized thunder. No grey lattice protruded, no galvanometer twitched. The chronometer hanging from Dawlish's belt ticked anew, minute hands stuttering before settling into concord with the world's indifferent heartbeat. Weeks later, telegraph lines remained silent, save wholesome chatter of rates and weather. The Clevedon mast warmed to full power without avian carnage. Aldershot toasted total amortization, yet Dawlish filed one private report. Tenant vacated. Property unfit for habitation. Structural void persists beneath leasehold. She stored it in a sealed drawer beneath Bullock's braid, Bessel's ledger, and Vincey's brass rod tokens of a covenant scarcely understood. Each spring she visits Clay Cross to tamp fresh slag over the buried bulb, hearing in the distance the new electric expresses humming peaceably along bright rails. Yet some dusks the railheads glimmer with a faint frost that is not due, and migrant birds veer wide of the line in uneasy choreography, as though reminded that curiosity like credit sleeps only between the knocks of collection. The mouldering ledger of leases would have closed forever. Perhaps, had the earth itself not stirred beneath Clay Cross, on the muggy night of 29 July 1907, miners descending the Nopos. 3-shaft felt the cage judder, ratchet pins shivering as though teeth no longer meshed. Halfway down they met a sulphurous gust and a humming so low it set teeth buzzing. When the cage touched bottom, every carbide lamp guttered to violet, revealing slag walls newly veined in pearlescent rings, the fossil thunder ripples of Dawlish's buried crucible. A foreman struck steel to flint. The spark leapt sideways, sucked into the rock, with a sound like distant telegraph clicks. He ordered immediate retreat. By dawn, the pithead timbers sweated beads of quicksilver that rolled uphill against gravity, merging, dividing, mapping girders in illegible cartography. Clara Dawlish arrived before inspectors could file their nervous reports. The fused braid still ringed her wrist, now grey at the roots like wire rope. She descended in a service cage with 2 volunteer colliers and a barrow of fused glass lily plaques. At the cavity wall she found a flint-sharp fissure gaping where slag bulb and shale had once knitted seamless. The chasm breathed. Warm draught smelled of ozone and brine, as though iron had opened into some pelagic vault. Lowering her lamp, she glimpsed, far within, a slow pulse of dim grey heartbeat of vacancy reacquiring form. She felt the braid tighten, each copper strand lifting from dermis as though answering roll call. In that instant, she knew the crucible had held, not the lodger's whole estate but merely its title deed. The corpus, thrown into molten flux, had diffused, awaited recollection, and now summoned what fragments still haunted ether, rail and marrow. Dawlish's instinct was flight, but Bullock's final phrase echoed, "Give heat unto heat, leave thought behind." Thought, she realized, had been the parasite's true nutrient. Every calculation, every chronological vigilance had spurred its compound interest. She signaled the volunteers to smash their lamps, dousing intellect's glow, then wedged lily plaques around the fissure to confuse conductive lattices with amorphous glass. Darkness closed like ink. The humming faltered, uncertain. In that blind corridor she quieted even heartbeat, recalling child, lessons of motionless hide, and seek. Minutes hours passed while the chasm's breath slowed, warm draught turning to chill exhalation. When at last she dared strike flint, the cavity's pulse had sunk to a sullen ember no brighter than spent charcoal. Far above, on a deserted embankment north of Crewe, Mr. Vincey reappeared as though stepped sideways from taut dusk. His boots were dust grey, his beard crusted with frost that melted, though night remained warm. He walked the ballast uncertainly until the distant glow of signal oil lamps oriented him. Memory returned in errant flashes. The inspection motor, car, Dawlish's outstretched hand, a locomotive's whistle shredding mist. He remembered conceding tenancy of flesh, fracturing into circuits of thought and, then silence, deeper than any tomb. Now, returned, he felt merely hollow, a solicitor whose ledgers had burned. Reaching the nearest wayside hut, he hammered until a porter, blanching at the apparition, offered water and telegraph forms. Vincey declined the instruments. He asked only for a taper and a single-wick lantern, whose muted flame he could watch without calculations. Dawn found him trudging toward Carlisle, stopping at each milepost to lay palm against iron, listening. Rails answered in baked-in warmth, not in code. When, at milepost 193 he felt nothing but the honest shiver of rolling plate. Tears blurred his sight. He sat upon the sleeper, extracting a battered matchbox from coat lining a box he had relinquished, yet which now rested cold and empty. Lifting the lid, he saw only wood dust and a flake of mica shaped like a watermark. Whatever tithe the lodger had demanded of him appeared settled, at least in coin of presence. Just before midday, the bowl of a telegraph pole creaked. A wren settled on the wire, chirruped, and flitted onward unscorched. Vincey exhaled, realizing his return might be proof not of victory but of abdication. The lodger no longer needed him as negotiator. Its audit trended elsewhere too, deeper seams, higher masts, stranger media than blood. He rose and turned south toward London, mind empty of clauses, resolved only to warn those who might still imagine mastery lay in vault or statute. Mrs. Bullock died 3 weeks later, eyes open, fingers tracing silent dashes on the blanket that cooled even as nurses folded it. Sharp attended the funeral and placed upon the coffin a miniature iron lily cast from the very slag above Clay Cross. In his eulogy, he told no tales of parasitic intelligences. He spoke instead of debt retired, of curiosity moderated by mercy. Yet the church organ emitted a faint subharmonic that set the rose windows vibrating, showering pews with motes of coloured dust no parishioner could afterwards sweep away. Dawlish, her wrist scar now pale glass, declined new Admiralty contracts. She taught evening classes on grounding and surge suppression, insisting students conduct final demonstrations with batteries unconnected, circuits closed only in imagination. Some scoffed, but those who listened swore the classroom felt lighter, as though walls inhaled serenity. She returned annually to Clay Cross, each visit sealing fresh lily plaques into any fissure the miners reported. The humming never revived, yet slag rings still grew, tracing geology's secret memory of heat and trespass. On the first day of 1910, Marconists at Poldhu captured a whisper threaded beneath continental weather bulletins. 3 dots, 3 dashes. 3 dots an older signal, measured, patient. They logged it, shrugged, and continued relaying market prices. The wave swept north through ether, touched wireless masts, railway rails, the barrel vaults of silent pits, but met only quiet minds unquickened by the thrill of novelty. Far inland, Vincey, now caretaker of a Keswick library, heard the winter wind hiss in chimney flues. He smiled, placed another coal upon the fire, and refused to wonder at its strange resonance. So the ledger closes for a while, yet if some night you peer too intently into the shimmer atop telegraph wires, or count the heartbeats of a dynamo with forensic delight, recall the vacated but never annulled lease. Between thought and matter lies only provisional deed, and curiosity may, at the turn of an idle screw, admit once more a tenant who balances accounts in pulses of dread and signs its name in ashes that crawl. Until humility settles as final seal, mind and muscle are but caretakers upon a property older than rails, vaster than ether, and patient as the starlight that bathes the turning world. The languid hush of summer 1912 found Mr. Vincey cataloguing pamphlets in the shadowed loft of the Keswick Mechanics Institute, his work punctuated only by the tick of a Smith's bracket clock, whose mainspring he wound each dawn. One humid afternoon the clock stopped at 3:17, its pendulum held as though by unseen calipers. Vincey touched the brass case, expecting the old chill of occult circuitry, yet felt merely stillness. He wound again. The mechanism refused to stir. He listened first for Morse within the hush, then for deeper tremors in his own pulse and sensed at length a different disturbance. A tremor of earth, faint but regular, like a giant's distant metronome. Shelves quivered, dust spiraled in slow vortices lit by lancelets of sun. Papers on the lectern rustled, though no draught slipped beneath the eaves. Something subterranean, not aerial, tapped now at the world's bones. A messenger arrived from Penrith with a telegram signed C. Dawlish. Seismic anomalies traced to coal seams. Lily Plaques fissuring. Proceed Claycross with utmost discretion. Vincey felt years peel away. He packed notebook, transit level, and the brass rod that for a decade had slept inert beneath oiled rags. The rod thrummed at his touch, tracing circles of faint frost on the valise leather. Outside, Derwent water lay glassy, reeds kept their counsel. He strode toward the early train, boots echoing across the stone quay where, once, snow-rimmed reeds had clicked forlorn code. The quay was silent now, but in the water he glimpsed rings, widening no pebble had struck. Southbound carriages rattled through Eden Valley. Vincey shared a compartment with a ministry geologist who spoke of unexpected subsidences, pitstones popping like chestnuts, capped shafts, breathing warm vapor. Seismoscope needles wrote tidy waves from Wales to the Wash, yet epicenters refused triangulation. When Vincey inquired at what hour disturbances spiked, the geologist answered, 3:15, give or take 2 minutes, and chuckled uneasily at coincidence. Vincey made no reply. He glanced at the brass rod, frost veining its tip spread halfway to the ferrule though the compartment sweltered. In his mind he heard Bullock's dying warning, leave thought behind. Yet thoughts crowded like passengers on a blacked-out platform. They reached Clay Cross at dusk. Dawlish waited beyond the goods yard, lamp-hooded, braid still encircling her wrist though years had browned its copper to verdigris. She spoke little as they descended. No, 3-shaft, the service cage rattling against guide rails furred with new crystal, not the familiar grey filaments, but microfaceted prisms glittering pale pink, refracting firelight in Morse fragments no one dared translate. At the bulb of fused slag they found lily plaques shattered, glass shards melted into iridescent puddles. From the center of that ruin, a column of prismatic growth curved upward like quartz seeking daylight, humming at pitch too low for ear, too deep for drum, vibrating marrow instead. Dawlish produced a diminutive thermocouple, copper head etched with lilies, wired to a pocket galvanometer. The needle danced erratically, then steadied full scale. Furnace effect reversed, she muttered. Instead of consuming lattice, it incubates new crystal. Vincey knelt, touching rod to prism. Frost raced up copper strands, blossoming at contact point into a flake whose geometry mimicked telegraph snow. The prism's hum rose 1 octave, distant timbers groaned in sympathy. The mine breathed again, warm and rank. Dawlish's colour drained. We fed it to iron, she said, voice brittle. It reinvested in silica. Tremor intensified. Shale cracked overhead, spalling dust in glittering rain. Colliers fled, cages clattered. Dawlish dragged Vincey toward the upcast drift, ascending on foot while the rod thumped like a resisting heartbeat. At 3. 17, precisely a boom rolled up the seams. Neither explosion nor collapse, but a sonorous chord, as if organ pipes hidden in bedrock had opened at once. Surface lights flickered. Telegraph wires twanged like plucked harpstrings. Vincey dropped to one knee, covering ears. The rod warmed for the first time in years ice, sublimating into steam. Dawn revealed fissures rayed across spoil heaps, each lined by prisms glinting with sunrise. The yard's weighbridge stood askew, pit gantries bowed. Dawlish telephoned London. The line crackled too fiercely to carry speech. She turned to Vincey. Rails and ether alike proved unsuitable. Now, it seeds the crust itself. Vincey stared at his aged hands, remembering case, law upon mineral rights. The tenant sought freehold. They convened with Sharp in a disused weighhouse. Maps rustled beneath trembling lantern light. Seismographs showed rising power law escalation, doubling amplitudes every 12 hours. Dawlish proposed injecting thermite slurry into the seam sheet enough, perhaps to vitrify crystal anew. Sharp countered with controlled flooding, drown growth beneath brine. Vincey alone argued for a different measure: intellectual austerity. It quickens when we measure, he said, when we name. But rails, towers, and mines were all monuments to human curiosity. Austerity seemed as implausible as unlearning speech. A telegraph runner burst in, cheeks sooty. London cables repeating distress admiralty yards, blast furnaces, telephone exchanges all, registering harmonic. 3:17. They request guidance. Dawlish exhaled bitter laugh. Guidance? We hold the lease, they hold the mortgage. She turned to Vincey. Thermite and brine buy time. Your austerity must follow, or next we'll fuse continents. Vincey nodded, but knew humanity bargaining for silence resembled addicts, vowing abstinence while fingering fresh wires. By noon, portable boilers hissed, pumping hot salt slurry deep into fissures. Thermite canisters lowered on chains flared white, slagging prisms to bubbly glass. The ground bucked. Then still no chord at 15. 17. Only the ordinary creak of settling earth. Workers cheered hollow cheers. Yet Vincey gazed across spoil heaps where new crystals already winked beneath ash, small, eager, innumerable. He realized the tenant no longer waited for invitation. It had learned to notarize its presence in any element: curiosity, agitated copper, iron, silica, perhaps flesh. That night he took Dawlish aside beside the cooling slag pool. Stars shuddered faintly overhead, as though ether itself vibrated. We cannot unthink, he said. The more we learn, the richer its estate. But ignorance is impossible. Dawlish touched the braid, now fused to her pulse. Then perhaps we refine thought, make it less appetizing. Humility as insulation, wonder tempered by dread. Vincey smiled without mirth. The hardest alloy to forge. They stood in silence until the slag cracked, venting a plume of steam that smelled of wet stone, yet hissed 3 short, 3 long, 3 short, ever patient, ever provisional. In the years that followed, earth tremors tapered, but never ceased. Crystal blooms appeared in quarries, telephone relays, even within milk-glass shades of fashionable drawing rooms. They were filed under curiosities, dusted by maids, admired in candlelight. Dawlish published quiet papers on dielectric modesty, suggesting designs that leached resonance, circuits that faded to mute. Manufactories shrugged inefficiency cost profit. Vincey retired for good, tending library fires whose coals he never stirred to bright. Yet on some chill mornings the poker sanglow, resonant, and he would still its voice with ash, whispering no questions. And so the world turned, rails shining, masts towering, laboratories thrumming. The ledger's ink grew faint on human pages, but beneath, in crystal script, the tenant annotated Marginson audit new scholars would one day illuminate, perhaps too eagerly. For the claim persists: mind in matter, matter in mind, bound by covenants older than calculation. Should pulse and curiosity align once more at the appointed hour, Tenancy may rise from quartz or cloud, collect its arrears in rhythms of tremor and hush, and remind those who measure that every observation is a signature upon a lease whose clauses curve beyond horizon, patient as starlight, exact as the turning world. Noon heat pressed upon the slates of Keswick in August 1914, yet Mr. Vincey sensed a deeper fever in the library's timbers. Every shelf plank thrummed faintly, synchronized to continental artillery he could not yet know existed. When he held Bullock's neglected braid to the window glass, pink prisms bloomed in the pane's heartwood, mapping Europe in miniature fault lines. Patrons complained their fountain pens bled backwards, ink crawling against nibs. A telegram arrived in ciphered shorthand, Dawlish's hand summoning him to the new Admiralty signalling yard at Scarborough. Before dusk, before broadcast. Vincey packed the brass rod, now webbed by rime even in furnace weather, and bolted the library without logging returns. Outside, Derwentwater rippled to concentric beats, as if invisible pile drivers stitched the lakebed for unseen pylons. Dawlish met him on the cliff road above the wireless installations, dark skirts snapping in gale driven not by weather but by volt. Tower after lattice tower stood charged, awaiting midnight tests of trans-channel telephony for mobilizing fleets. Each mast wore iron lily talismans she had ordered affixed, yet crystal threads already furred the lower stays, sipping field strength like lampreys. "They will pump 10 times Clevedon's wattage," she warned. Voice raucous from salt and insomnia. Vincey glanced at his rod, frost scaled away, revealing veins of pale quartz pulsing like arteries. "We cannot unthink," he began, but she cut him short. "Then we must misthink detune their feast." She produced a folded blueprint. A locomotive workshop south of York had refitted the dormant furnace, car into a roving, null-frequency inhibitor, crucible now lined with bismuth glass, to scatter harmonics into incoherent heat. At 19:00, a military goods train would haul it along the coastal spur, intersecting the ether lobes before midnight discharge. If the wagon survived past Whitby, the towers might howl but would starve. The train departed beneath a sunset like torn copper foil. Soldiers crowded the brake vans, rifles slick with sea spray, unaware their cargo contained a history older than gunsmoke. Vincey rode within the furnace car, gauging rod resonance against a pocket seismograph that registered not ground shock but aerial standing waves. Every milepost ticked a sharper spike. Dawlish worked the inhibitors, red-lined dials labeled oblivion and antiphone, her fused braid sparking each time steel wheels crossed insulated joints. At Robin Hood's Bay, the first overtone struck. Masts behind them flared corona that licked struts in grey salmon arcs, and all along the line the telegraph poles chimed like crystal goblets tolled by funeral gloves. Children on the cliff top ran, believing thunder. Within the car, quartz flecks sang inside slag walls, shaping phantom Morse that spelled only one immutable clause: tenancy foreclosed. At 23:52, the locomotive crested the viaduct into a salt mist thicker than coal smoke. The furnace crucible bucked molten bismuth vomiting sparks that froze into whirls of negative light. Vincey glimpsed through a plank seam vast silhouettes pacing the serpentities, half steam, half Euclid, their strides mirrored by shudders in the viaduct's girders. He tightened the rod against a copper bus, discharging frost that hissed where it met glowing metal. Dawlish kicked the phase pedal. Inhibitors roared to full incoherence, a howl so profound it cancelled every other sound, leaving a vacuum of perception. The spectral silhouettes faltered, limbs dissolving into shards. Yet the viaduct itself unfurled prisms along its handrails, steel turning translucent under parasitic crystallography. Rails sagged like wax. The driver opened the regulator to reckless sweep, iron tires spitting rainbow chips into the abyss. Midnight bells from Scarborough Castle towered faintly across the void. With them came the carrier surge. Admiralty masts poured their test call into ether. A pulse of coherent dread speared the furnace car, shattering its viewports, inflaming slag bed into a white sphere that lifted, weightless, until Dawlish triggered the floor hatch. The globe crashed through to the chalk ravine below, detonating in a bloom of silent phosphorescence that birthed a crater ringed in molten lilies. Shocklight backlit bone-white surf and stripped prisms from viaduct iron like scales from a panicked fish. The locomotive rocketed clear onto stable earth. Behind, rust-crimson girders folded inward, swallowing tenant fragments in a roar that sprayed vitrified sand across half a mile of moor. Dawn found the survivor steersman stunned, soldiers deaf but breathing marooned by twisted rails. Dawlish stood beside Vincey, atop ballast glazed to smoky mirror, their reflections riddled by minute fractures that healed as they watched. The braid on her wrist had cooled to mere copper. His brass rod dulled, ice-free. Far off, Admiralty transmitters crackled headlines of war, yet no harmonic echoed beneath. Dawlish exhaled a two-word verdict. Interest paused. Vincey studied the sunrise diffused through salt haze, mindful the ledger yet persisted somewhere beneath fused chalk. Or refinanced, he murmured. They gathered instruments and limped south along silent track, stepping over lily-shaped shards that tinkled like distant telegraph keys whenever shoenails met them. Investigations attributed the viaduct's collapse to enemy sabotage. Scarborough's masts continued broadcasting, oblivious that their first triumphant signal had skimmed extinction. Dawlish petitioned for widespread deployment of inhibitor wagons, but war budgets chased munitions, not metaphysics. She returned to London, drafting memoranda in vanishing ink diagrams that faded after study, leaving only the memory of caution. Vincey resumed his library post, rewarding readers who closed books gently. Some nights he heard gun barrage rolling from France, but the poker by his hearth remained silent, and Derwentwater reads no longer spelled dread. One winter's eve, an artillery officer on leave visited Keswick, recounting how barrage balloons draped in silver netting sometimes rang with singing crystals before a bombardment. He produced a shard, eager for identification. Vincey recognized the lodger's quartz, now suffused with gunpowder, soot-mined learning new dialects. He advised burying it in unbroken turf, and spoke no more. After the officer left, Vincey penned a brief note to Dawlish. Tenant adapts. Humility must accelerate. He sealed it with wax, impressed by the last intact lily plaque, then returned to shelving pamphlets, careful not to ponder their spines too curiously. Outside, snow muffled the world into provisional silence, while, far beneath chalk and iron, residual prisms timed their growth to the artillery's relentless through a new clock for an old accountant, patient as ever, counting credits in the turning world. Autumn 1916 draped Keswick in blackout cloth. Windows wore crossed tape. Even Derwentwater hid its glints beneath smothered moonlight. Yet when Mr. Vincey stepped from the Mechanics' Institute with an armful of pamphlets for pulping, he glimpsed an eerie fluorescence trembling along the lake's far Sharino lantern, but a skein of pale prisms rippling like phosphor kelp. He felt the brass rod, long dormant inside his coat sleeve, twitch as though tasting the air. Dread nudged him south again to Scarborough, where Clara Dawlish was burdened by new Admiralty requisitions. The fleet demanded long. Wave arrays lashed to dreadnought funnels, global communication at any cost. She greeted him within a corrugated hut whose floorboards creaked to invisible harmonics. "They have hung transmitters from every mast," she rasped, pressing her gloved hand over the fused braid. "We throttle one lattice. They forge 10. The lodger drinks interference like port." Vincey laid maps across a flickering oil lamp. Reports of prism bloom now threaded British coastlines, Portsmouth Dry, docks, Belfast slipways, even railheads shunting munitions to the Somme. Minor tremors recurred at 3:17 yet again, as if the lodger still kept ledger by that haunted stroke. Dawlish revealed a prototype, quenched spark scrambler that squirted messages into stochastic bursts beyond crystal appetite. But the apparatus demanded a silent Carriera gap the Admiralty refused. "They heed only clarity," she said, voice breaking. Vincey's thoughts retreated to Bullock's dictum. Give heat unto heat, leave thought behind. Perhaps the war itself so savage, so chaotic might camouflage an act of deliberate incoherence. Christmas that year was stifled by Zeppelin raids, the sky scarred with searchlight rips. Dawlish's scrambler rode a hospital supply train toward Folkestone, disguised as crates of surgical ether. Vincey travelled with her, logging each tremor on frail graph paper. At Ashford the gauges jumped, rails ahead limbed themselves in faint rows, and the night smell of coal smoke soured to ozone. The engineer throttled back, trucks jangled. From the embankment mist rose in geometric columns, prisms aggregating like frost spires and emitting a dull organ note no shell could match. Vincey hissed incoherence now, and Dawlish flung the scrambler's toggles wide. Wire coils convulsed, spewing atonal bursts that shattered lamp chimneys, but the rose glow faltered. Prism pillars shuttered inward, splintering as though starved of rhythm. The train crawled through falling shards. Each fracture tinkled a dying Morse that spelled nothing. Yet victory rang hollower than shell casings. In London, the War Office insisted on uniform code discipline, forbidding randomization that might garble orders. Dawlish was reprimanded. Her laboratory shuttered. Soon new prisms erupted along French supply depots, mapping the path of every encoded directive. Vincey, disillusioned, returned to Keswick, but the lake no longer slept. On still nights, concentric rings pulsed from its reed beds without stone to start them. He saw small fish drifting belly up, scales filmed with crystal dust. In March 1000, 917 telegrams arrived from Sharpno Lieutenant Colonel Sharp, Royal Engineers stationed at Arras. Prism growths infiltrated dugout timbers, threatening to short mines before detonation. Could Dawlish's scrambler be scaled? She answered with new drawings. Mobile arrays slung beneath kite balloons, sowing discord above the trenches. Vincey accompanied her across the channel inside a drafty Reet biplane, engine rattle masking his racing pulse. Over shell-scalloped ground, the balloons loosed broadband chaos into gun-thick sky. Where waves met prisms, the structures dulled, sloughing to ash. Yet the ash fused with cordite fumes, drifting into lungs until soldiers coughed grey lace. Medics noted nerve tremors, dreams of ticking lilies. Disorder starved the tenant, but its remnant now seeped through men. Nights at Arras Vincey heard distant artillery blend into subterranean chords, each shockwave etched by quartz dust into dugout wall sluminous after images, like negatives of the thunder ripples at Clay Cross. He and Dawlish realized the war itself, chaotic yet clocked, had grown the lodger, a body of resonance far broader than any rail. Where once curiosity had been the conduit, now mechanized slaughter provided harmonics vast and regular. To starve it fully would require a silence beyond armistice. November 11th, 1918. Sirens ululated across London, church bells erupted, crowds sang, whistles shrilled, an incoherent roar the tenant could scarcely pass. Dawlish stood beside Vincey on the Thames embankment, both drained by influenza yet alive. She lifted Bullock's Braidat, last cool, inert. Prism shards along bridge trusses dulled to dust. It seemed the lodger, oversaturated by victory's chaotic frequencies, withdrew again to latency. Vincey exhaled, but felt ledger pages still flutter in some hidden draft. Years later, in 1922, when the British Broadcasting Company beamed its first public concert, Dawlish sat before a crystal set, headphones trembling. She had insisted the transmitter engineers include quench circuits tuned to stochastic resonances, an homage to scramblers past. The violins soared, waves dancing through ether. In Keswick, Vincey adjusted his own modest receiver, brass rod balanced across coil. The music arrived pure, unmarred by Morse. He allowed himself a cautious smile, murmuring, "Least deferred." Yet when the orchestra paused for applause, a faint triple pulse crept beneath the static ... Dotold. Patient, curious. Vincey lowered the volume, chose not to listen further. and stoked the hearth until flames spoke only of mundane combustion. Outside, Derwentwater sighed under winter starlight, its reeds motionless, while far below the crust, latent prisms measured the distance between silence and signal, waiting for a world that might one day forget dread and chase perfect coherence once more through the turning, ever-listening dark. In the spring of 1927, Mr. Vincey queued with clerks and schoolboys outside Selfridge's to witness a marvel build as high-definition pictures flung through air. Inside a curtained booth, John Logie Baird's cathode mosaic hissed and bloomed with ghost-pale faces looping in 30-line flicker. The crowd cooed. Vincey felt the brass rod, long secreted in his cane, stir with arthritic unrest. When the demonstrator maximized contrast, entire lines of the picture spalled into crystalline motes that skittered down the screen's edge, dissolving before they reached the carpet. No one else noticed. Vincey hurried away, breath fogging in unnatural warmth, convinced that each new miracle erected fresh corridors for a creditor who never forgot an address. He wired Clara Dawlish, now Professor Emerita of Electromechanics, at Imperial describing the shimmering debris. Her reply arrived by motorcycle courier, written across a torn exam bluebook. Televisor's cycle at 10,375, Haas harmonic of 207.5. Seed frequency for prism growth. We must inoculate before mass adoption. She proposed doping broadcast valves with erratic trace impurities. Germanium flex, too inconsistent for lattice resonance. Manufacturers balked at the cost, yet her students smuggled flawed valves into warehouses, stamping them experimental, not for sale, knowing full well curiosity would leak them into production lines. By autumn, sets across London emitted a faint, perpetual hishigly enough to foil coherence, yet soft enough for audiences to blame teething problems. The prisms withered where the hiss prevailed. Summer 1932 brought a drought that cracked clay seams beneath the abandoned clay cross pit. Survey crews found the quartz bloom inert, its once singing facets clouded like smoked glass. Dawlish, cane-tapping against fossil thunder rings, allowed herself the rare solace of triumph. But as she and Vincey traced the deepest gallery, the rod in his hand convulsed, tip frosting despite 90-degree heat. Far down a collapsed drift, water trickled through shale, carrying with it micron-fine kristallsnow, longer rose or grey but transparent, refracting light into jittering spectra. They moved not with coherent hum but with random, staccato snaps like popcorn in a distant hearth. Dawlish sampled the fluid. Spectrograph lines leapt across the plate in pure chance, every peak a different isotope of silicon. Our alloy of disorder, she murmured, but it learns to harvest even that. Vincey pictured billions of wireless valves sizzling atop mantelpieces, each hiss nourishing these infant motes through stochastic drizzle. That night, in lodgings overlooking Matlock Gorge, Vincey dreamed of the Trans-British Express once more racing north, every window aflame with flickering faces from cathode tubes. The train's steel skin teemed with transparent crystals that flexed and tensed like muscular fiber, propelling the locomotive faster than steam could drive it. Inside, passengers sat transfixed by luminous screens, unaware that the carriage floor had dissolved to a brittle prism crust. At milepost 193/4, the crust cracked, and the whole consist vanished, not derailed but phased into a glittering mist that rode above the rails, laughing in silent dots and dashes. In 1935, Air Ministry scientists invited Dawlish to consult on a secret radio detection and ranging array at Bawdsey Manor. Twin towers threw pulses across the North Sea, listening for echoes of aluminium wings. On a clear January dawn, she and Vincey climbed the receiver mast, wind moaning through guy ropes. The moment technicians keyed the pulse modulator, a bloom of microscopic crystals dusted the insulators, each spark trace frozen into fractal claws that pointed unerringly toward Saxony. Vincey's rod rattled. He felt marrow vibrate in sympathy. Dawlish whispered, "The tenant finds utility in reflection, now echo as ledger." return signal as interest. She insisted on installing phase jitter generatorstony thyrotron loops that nudged each outgoing pulse by random tens of microseconds. Echoes blurred into noise that still revealed bombers but starved the prism claws, which dulled and slewed into powder. War clouds gathered again. Whitehall embraced Dawlish's chaotic masking as covert advantage, though few understood its older purpose. Vincey, aged yet unbroken, toured coastal stations teaching radar crews to tolerate woollier screens, preaching that perfection was the predator's lure. Some nights, pacing concrete ops rooms, he fancied he heard 3 dots, 3 dashes, 3 dots tick from within the cathode ray itself, but he refused to amplify the gain to verify. On VE Day, 1945, London's wireless loudspeakers erupted in pure, triumphant signal, no jitter, no break. Crowds demanded clarity. That midnight, prisms blossomed along Westminster Bridge, clear as icicles despite warm drizzle, spelling Morse only children dared repeat. Vincey, leaning on the scarred cane, watched soldiers slice them away with bayonets that sparked at every blow. He realized the war's end had revived humanity's appetite for clean wavelengths, for shining corridors devoid of the blessed static Dawlish had championed. The ledger's pages rustled anew. His last visit to Imperial found Dawlish stooped yet resolute, plans spread for a worldwide tangle of satellites soon-to-be artificial moons. She sketched deliberate clock skews, noise injections, fail-open grounds, an architecture of humility poised to orbit. Vincey pressed her liver, spotted hand. "We may delay collection," he said, "but never cancel the debt." Dawlish smiled through pain. "Then we bequeath our heirs the habit of paying in paradox, feeding curiosity with crumbs of chaos." Above them, a prototype cathode globe spun, mapping future orbits in cyan. Tiny fractures webbed its inner phosphor where random pulses already gnawed, patient as stars. Vincey died that winter, brass rod buried beside him under slate cairn on Castlerig Fell. Those who carried the coffin swore it weighed hardly more than the man. At the interment, Dawlish placed the final unbroken lily plaque upon the Maunder sigil of vigilance. Wind hissed through stone circle monoliths. One ancient megalith answered with 3 faint clicks, like hammer on telegraph sounder. Dawlish turned away, savour-seeing the noise of it imperfect, scattered hoping the earth, for a while longer, would keep its deeper contracts blurred, its resonances slightly out of tune, preserving a fragile tenancy for minds humble enough to endure amid the grand, static-flecked mystery of the ever-turning world. Clara Dawlish awoke on the morning of 4 October, 1957, to the tremor of headlines pounding along the terrace doors. An artificial moon had risen over the steppe, chirping a beacon clear and perfect on frequencies no cloud could blur. The press cried triumph. The old professor felt only chill. In her study, overlooking a soot-dusted courtyard, she unfolded the telegram confirming orbit, fingers tracing the Morse trace inked across the margin, necessary, precise, a geometry the lodger had always favoured. The braid fused to her wrist was long removed in surgery, yet a phantom stiffness returned, skin prickling with that remembered cadence of 3 dot, 3 dash, 3 dot. Dawlish's last pupil, Thomas Vincey, grand-nephew of the solicitor, knocked timidly. He carried a notebook dense with telemetry. "The satellite repeats 1 kilohertz," he said. "A carrier pure as glass. Clearer than any signal we've measured." Dawlish closed her eyes. Behind them glimmered prisms singing in iron rails, trembling in wireless coils, breeding among radar spires. She had preached noise, urged benevolent blur, but the world had abandoned static for crystalline clarity. "It will call them back," she murmured, "unless we answer with humility." Vincey steadied her shoulder, sensing weight beyond frailty. She rummaged through drawers until she found the last unspent lily plaque, small as a shilling, cast from fused slag at Clay Cross. Into its glass she had ground defexer bubbles, stray tungsten grain imperfections no lattice could digest. She pressed it into the young man's palm. "Carry this to Jodrell Bank," she instructed, "and lace your receiver's first mixer with shards from its rim. Degrade the echo, Thomas. Make the heavens stammer." He hesitated, quoting spec sheets that prize decimal fidelity. Dawlish's whisper sharpened. "Curiosity without caution is invitation." That dusk, the professor drafted her final memorandum, written in violet ink that faded even as it flowed. "Every perfect note may summon tenancy. Let our music falter by design." She pinned the page to her laboratory corkboard beneath a lithograph of Bessel, Vincey, Bullock, and Arkwright faces, grainy but watching still. Then, turning down lamps until filaments purred like distant wires, she settled in the wing chair once used by Mrs. Bullock during trance sittings. Outside, televisions flickered in parlors. Within each cathode bloom micro. Shards glinted, infant prisms awaiting resonance. Midnight tolled. Somewhere over London, the satellite's pulse knifed through stratospheric hiss, struck lead roofs, slipped into copper gutters, raced through ground loops into tram rails and telephone grids. Dawlish felt the boarding, gentle at first, like a draft beneath a door. Glassware sang, dust motes fluttered into fractal spirals. In the corridor, wind chimes of brass lettered her student's degree, plaques rattled dots and dashes. She rose, leaning on Vincey's old cane. At 3:17 exactly, the building's dynamos paused, caught in a silence thick as slag. The lodger tested hinges long untended. She answered by darkening her mind-emptying equations, erasing diagrams holding only the blurred memory of Bessel's voice, whispering wonder, tempered by dread. The silence lengthened, seeking shape against her unfigured thoughts, but found only haze. A pane cracked behind her. Prisms bled from the wound, fragile, tentative. Dawlish tapped the cane's brass ferrule once against the parquet. The impact jolted a radiator valve. It stuttered an offbeat rattle, a fumble in rhythm. The prisms shivered, dulled, and sloughed into powder that rolled harmlessly beneath the skirting board. At dawn, Thomas Vincey telephoned from Cheshire. The Jodrell receiver had gone inexplicably grainy the moment the satellite cleared the horizon, its call now sputtering through a lace of stochastic delay. "It isn't elegant," he admitted, "but we can still derive orbit." And the Akauhatever, it was retreated. Dawlish allowed a thin smile. "Leave the noise in, Thomas. Publish no schematics. Let the world believe coherence an accident." She replaced the receiver, breathing the coal-tainted air with something like relief. Later that day, a groundskeeper found her seated beneath the portrait cluster, eyes closed, pulse ceased at 3:15. On her lap lay the violet memorandum, ink already ghosting into parchmenta deliberate fade. At the funeral, Vincey placed the imperfect lily plaque upon the casket, its flawed glass catching sunlight in broken rainbows that danced, scattered, refused alignment. The mourners heard a faint hiss from the church organ, nothing more. In the years that followed, television sharpened, satellites multiplied, data lines clarified to laser-fine beams. Yet at the core of every coding standard, some curious redundancy lingered phased dither, random jitter, a checksum born of Dawlish's doctrine. Engineers called it safety margin. Few recalled its truer purpose, an offering of entropy, a tithe of roughness, bartered so the lodger's ledger never quite balanced. And still, on quiet nights beneath the turning world, when transmitters idle and receivers sleep, stray carriers wander the band's 3 short, 3 long, 3 short seeking vacancy. They find only half-voiced echoes, static flecked, half-forgotten, and turn away to circle silently beyond the web of orbiting crystals. For mind's claim on matter remains provisional, renewed each moment by the mercy of imperfection, and humanity, if wise, will let its songs falter, its pictures blur, its footfall stumbleless, the perfect note ring clear, the rails shine without rust, and tenancy before closed forever.